Good afternoon to everyone who's joined us today for the Living Heritage Symposium, and Happy New Year. I'm Shannon Miller. I'm the director of the City of San Antonio's Office of Historic Preservation. We would love to hear from you in the audience. If you would like to introduce yourself in the chat and tell us where you're from, that would be great so that people can see who's joining us today. And I'd like to just thank you very much for attending the kickoff of this fourth Living Heritage Symposium. We're going to start off this kickoff session with a short welcome video that showcases some of San Antonio's living heritage.
Hello, and welcome to the 2021 Living Heritage Symposium. I'm Shannon Miller. I'm the director of the City of San Antonio's Office of Historic Preservation, and I'm your host for this symposium. The Living Heritage Symposium works to develop best practices as it relates to the treatment of cultural and intangible heritage.
If you've attended our past symposia, you know we host receptions and tours throughout the symposium to give you a sense of San Antonio's unique cultural heritage.
This year, since we're hosting the symposium virtually and you won't be here, we decided to bring San Antonio to you.
We created this video to show you some of our work to preserve and celebrate San Antonio's living heritage.
At the first Living Heritage Symposium in 2017, we learned about San Francisco's Legacy Business Program. In February of 2018, we launched a program of our own.
We started with 10 businesses and have grown to 110. From businesses that perpetuate traditions to businesses that are uniquely San Antonio, the San Antonio Legacy Business Program celebrates these economic and cultural treasures.
Come with me to see a couple of those businesses. Now we're at Cool Crest Miniature Golf, one of San Antonio's most loved businesses. Let's check it out.
Opened in 1929, just as the country's Great Depression began, Cool Crest is one of the oldest continuously operated miniature golf courses in the world.
Hey guys!
Hello Shannon, how are you? Welcome to Cool Crest.
Oh, thank you. It's so good to see you. I'm here at Cool Crest with the Andre family. Talk to me a little bit about what made you all decide to buy Cool Crest and invest in it for the community.
Well, as you know, San Antonio has had Cool Crest for well over 90 years now. It's a place where we all had our first dates. It's all part of the fabric of the city, and we loved it so much, we wanted to keep it going. We're only the third owners here, so we're really standing on the shoulders of just a few people, and we're caretakers for the next group that will come behind us.
Absolutely, and I'm so glad you did. I love coming here to play. Thank you for having us.
Oh, anytime. And all of San Antonio is welcome too.
Absolutely. There are a lot more legacy businesses around San Antonio. Let's take a look.
Architectural Interiors marks its beginnings to 1968 when the Salas family opened Salas & Company, a small family-owned business dedicated to steel and fine woodworking. Rooted in old-world craftsmanship from Spain, the Salas family's expertise in custom furniture, cabinetry, and wood interiors has been handed down through 5 generations of the family. Today, Victor Salas is one of San Antonio's most trusted preservation craftsmen. From restoring 100-year-old wood windows to rehabbing interiors of San Antonio's historic homes, Architectural Interiors is committed to keeping San Antonio's heritage alive. Victor has been engaged with the OHP in traditional trades education and service learning hands-on preservation activities since we began in 2009. In 2020, Victor began training paid apprentices through our Living Heritage Trades Academy, ensuring a new generation of craftspeople ready to preserve. Victor's daughter Ashley is poised to keep the business running well into the 21st century. OHP has focused on trades education through STAR, Students Together Achieving Revitalization, Rehaborama, and wood window restoration workshops for over a decade. Building on that work, we pursued the formal creation of the Living Heritage Trades Academy. Focused on teaching traditional building methods through training and paid 10-week apprenticeships, the Academy fills a gap in a workforce training and preservation skills and leverages living heritage for economic prosperity. The Academy also underscores the idea that master craftspeople are just as important as our significant historic buildings. Treatment of properties that are significant for their cultural and social significance is a driving concept of the symposium. Our office has prioritized identifying places important to our diverse communities. For example, in 2019, we began an inventory of shotgun houses in San Antonio. We've identified almost 800 still standing and are working to create a non-contiguous cultural heritage district and potential historic designations as a result of this work. One thing we've learned about these tiny houses is how sustainable and climate ready they are, particularly for San Antonio's hot, humid environment. San Antonio, an active member of the Climate Heritage Network, focuses on sustainable practices like deconstruction and sustainable rehabilitation. We have an equity-driven framework that understands our most vulnerable populations will be disproportionately affected by hotter temperatures and flash flooding. Our staff worked with our Office of Sustainability to ensure that cultural heritage is interwoven throughout the city's climate action and adaptation plan.
We're glad that you're joining us, and we look forward to learning with you over the next several sessions. I hope you've enjoyed the tour. Now it's time for a snack at another legacy business, El Paraíso Ice Cream.
Well, I hope everyone enjoyed me looking like a dork. Just kidding. It was fun to do a little tour of San Antonio. I'm sorry that you all aren't here to see San Antonio for yourselves. I've seen in the chat a number of friends, even past Living Heritage Symposium attendees and presenters. So we're happy to have so many of you from all over, and very much look forward to the conversation. As you saw in the video, the purpose of the symposium is really to work on concrete program and policy recommendations that can be implemented here in San Antonio and in your communities. We have hosted the symposium by bringing in experts from around the world who focus on the climate and heritage, focus on how to treat properties that are maybe significant for reasons besides their architectural value. So they're culturally significant or historically significant. And sometimes those treatment methodologies are trickier. And then also discussing how to leverage our living heritage for community prosperity. From these discussions, we've developed action plans, and from those action plans, we've seen things such as the creation of our local legacy business program, the growth of our cultural heritage districts tool that we utilize, and also the significant expansion and growth of our Living Heritage Trades Academy. One of the things that we will miss, of course, in this virtual format is the World Cafe style roundtable discussions after the presentations. But we do invite you to put your thoughts and comments and questions in the chat or the Q&A function. Both are available. And after the presentation, we will address your questions and comments. And so please definitely participate. The conversation is really the most important part. For us to be successful at the local level, we know that we need sound preservation policy at the national level. As a member of the Executive Committee of Preservation Action for almost 20 years and former chair of that organization, we all value the important role of the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. It's an honor for us to launch the symposium today with an opening statement from Sara Bronin, who is President Biden's nominee to chair the ACHP. Sara will set the tone for the symposium by talking about her work and giving her insights and ideas for change in the preservation movement. Sara is an architect, attorney, professor, and policymaker whose interdisciplinary work focuses on how law and policy can foster more equitable, sustainable, well-designed, and connected places. She's a professor of the Cornell College of Architecture, Art, and Planning, and an associate faculty member of the Cornell Law School, and a faculty fellow of the Cornell Atkinson Center for Sustainability. Among other current projects, she leads the research team behind the groundbreaking Connecticut Zoning Atlas, the first interactive GIS map of all the zoning regulations in the state. Her book, Key to the City, which is under contract with W.W. Norton Press, will explore how zoning shapes our lives. Active in public service, Professor Bronin is a board member of Latinos in Heritage Conservation and an advisor for the National Trust for Historic Preservation. As the founder of Desegregate Connecticut, she leads a coalition that successfully advanced the first major statewide zoning reforms in several decades. Previously, she chaired Preservation Connecticut, served on the City of Hartford Historic Preservation Commission, and led Hartford's nationally recognized efforts to adopt a climate action plan and city plan, and to overhaul their zoning code. A seventh generation Texan, Sara is native Houstonian. She grew up working in her grandparents' Mexican restaurant. Sara, we're really thrilled to have you here with us. Thank you for taking the time to be with us.
Thank you, and hopefully you can see me and hear me. And I just am just so pleased to be here today. So thank you to Shannon and to Claudia for asking me to come and say a few words of what looks like it's going to be a really incredible conference. I do want to acknowledge that I'm beaming into you from Hartford, Connecticut, which are the ancestral lands of the Connecticut River Indians. I know that many of you are in Central Texas on the traditional lands of the Tonkawa and Payaya people, among others. And just to recognize that as we start our conversations today, I know issues of cultural sensitivity will be on the agenda for the conference. I'll also just say that I'm really grateful for the organizers that we are able to do this virtually. My sister is a doctor at UT San Antonio, and this is what we really need to do to stay safe. So thank you for making this happen, and I'm so glad that you're all here. So as Shannon said, I'm familiar with San Antonio, native Texan, sister lives there. And of course, I know it's a city with a tremendously rich history. And again, you know, those of you who are beaming in tonight from San Antonio know that it's not just the missions, it's not just the Alamo, but it is everything from indigenous roots to cultural foodways. Shannon revealed my bias in that regard in the Mexican restaurant business, and I loved your video highlighting that, those small businesses in San Antonio and your work there on that. But cultural foodways and contemporary 20th century movements that many of which, especially for the Latino community nationally, found their roots in San Antonio. So you know that there are so many stories, and you know that there's so much to do to give them what I would say the place that they deserve. So at this conference, I know you'll be talking about how to tell these stories and about many other issues at the forefront of the preservation movement today. So my brief comments will really focus on a few what I might call challenges to preservation, modern challenges, in the hopes that you will think about these challenges throughout this conference and beyond. And most importantly, think about how we as preservationists can shape solutions. I should also disclose, I guess Shannon gave you that information too, that as an attorney and professor, I often think about the solutions in terms of law and policy. So that's where I'm going to mostly focus my framing thoughts today. So with that in mind, I'll talk about three challenges. The first challenge I want to discuss is climate change, a big one also mentioned in the video. A second is housing, and a third is zoning. So given the breadth of topics that you'll be covering at the conference, I figured I would hone in on those that might be, that most resonate with my current work, and just again give some thoughts about how preservationists might weigh in on those discussions. So let's begin. One topic that you're going to be tackling tomorrow and assuredly throughout the conference is the topic of climate change. At one point, I think this phrase was taboo in Texas, in particular in the South, but I don't really think it is anymore. Yesterday in the Washington Post, a report came out that 80% of counties in the country experienced a heat wave. Behar County, I'm sure, was one of those. 40% experienced some kind of climate disaster. whether that be wildfires, mudslides, droughts, floods, or hurricanes. So that's 40%. San Antonio, was hit with extreme weather in 2021. So I know from my sister and from news reports, you had hailstorms in April and May, massive floods in July and October, 4 days and 6 inches of snow, which is mind-blowing for me, and record-setting freezing temperatures in February. So this is not normal at all, but it is a taste of what's ahead, whether you want to use the phrase climate change or not. You could also call it extreme weather. These climate shifts have had a really devastating effect on people's lives and their livelihoods. But from a historic preservation perspective, they also have had a devastating effect on our buildings. Not all buildings can take on water and hail damage. Pipes, they freeze and they burst. They cause irreversible damage. Murals in clay and wood, all of these are affected by precipitations, and that's not even mentioning issues like strong winds, again, that you've experienced as well. So San Antonio's historic buildings, like buildings all over the country, were not really well equipped to withstand this kind of sustained extreme weather. So stepping back and thinking from a policy standpoint, what should we do to address these issues? So I think, putting it really simply, we need to be sure that our buildings and our historic places are well prepared to withstand these kinds of conditions. What does that mean? So sometimes that means that we have to modify historic buildings in order to keep them safe. So let me just repeat that. Sometimes we have to modify historic buildings to keep them safe. Well, doesn't that fly in the face of preservation in the way that we've traditionally defined it? I don't think so. I think that we can figure out how to make those values, the values of aesthetic and conservation, compatible with disaster preparedness. And I think we can do it right. And if we do it right, we will be able to maintain the essence of our history, but also protect people's lives, people's property, your economy, including tourism, but of course, is central to San Antonio. So I think we have to get smarter and more flexible about the protective measures that we include in our laws. Unfortunately, our laws and policies don't always let us do that. So I'm going to distill a lot of detail in my scholarly work into just a couple of minutes. And I'll put in the chat at some point after this, maybe in the Q&A period, links to some of these papers. But one paper I wrote recently specifically focuses on the holes in our legal framework for disaster law. And the overarching theme of that paper, and you may have seen this in your own work, is that historic preservation has not been well integrated with local, state, and federal disaster programs, and it's not top of mind for local, state, and federal officials. Oftentimes, preservation is really an afterthought. So we as preservationists need to think more strategically about ensuring that historic places are part of disaster planning, so before the disaster happens, mitigation, which means things like ensuring and fortifying our places against hazards, as well as the recovery phase, the issue of historic debris that might be littered across the countryside after a major event is an issue that is not well resolved in our disaster planning laws and policies. So that's one topic that I thought was worth mentioning, and something that I hope you put on your to-do list in your community, whether it's San Antonio or elsewhere. Another thing that I wanted to mention today, just within this climate change framework, was a set of federal standards called the Secretary Standards for the Treatment of Historic Properties. And I'm pretty confident that that's what San Antonio's local historic commission bases many of its decisions on. And I say that because local commissions across the country base their decisions on the standards, as I'll call them, as well. So these standards are very broadly stated, There are a series of general principles about rehabilitating historic properties, and they weren't really written to deal with the challenge of climate change. So what I've seen in communities across the country is that people on the ground, whether they're local historic commissioners or people who just want to fix up a building after disaster and are not sure what to do, they need more guidance about what the Secretary's standards mean and how they can be flexibly applied to situations where we want to keep and preserve and protect historic buildings. So I would encourage you to think about whether you've seen the standards be applied in ways that actually hinder the preservation and protection of a historic resource. So maybe you can think of a few examples of that, and I'd love to talk about those in the Q&A. So strict preservation standards, you'll be hearing more about this topic tomorrow, no doubt. So the second challenge that I wanted to just bring to mind today, I wanted to briefly discuss is housing. And so you might say, well, how is housing a challenge to preservation? Well, I call it a challenge to preservation because especially recently, we have seen time and time again a clash between an unfortunate and avoidable clash oftentimes between the values of preservation and the dire need for new housing. This may be the case in San Antonio too, although I think you've had some successful historic rehabs for housing, thanks to local advocates, West Side Preservation Alliance, other leaders in your community. So I know you've had successes in marrying the two, but there are also challenges in your community and so many others across the country. So I, of course, as a preservationist, think that we have to protect the places that define our communities and give us meaning. But as preservationists, we also have to recognize that some change is not just tolerable, but important. So if we always stand in the way of new housing, if we're not creative, we might be hurting people and our neighbors more than we think. We all know that we're in a dire national crisis of epic proportions when it comes to housing. Again, I'll use my sister as your local example. She was hoping to buy a house at some point, but even as a doctor, she's looking across the city and San Antonio prices are out of control. And many of you have probably experienced that. Research, and I'm a academic, so I always go back to research. Research has shown that the more housing we build, the less likely it is that gentrification and displacement occurs. So we need to think about the need for historic preservation, housing, as well as community preservation as going hand in hand and really working to find those mutual solutions that benefit all of those goals. In some cases, it's too stark, right? Somebody's proposing we're tearing down these important historic buildings for housing development X. So in those situations, that's different. But I think we need to be more proactive as preservationists to help identify how new housing can be flexibly accommodated in our historic places and vice versa. So that's another thing that I'll put in your mind as you go through this conference and think about how housing, which is not an overarching topic of any of the days, but how housing fits into these conversations that you'll be having with some of the awesome panelists, that including my colleague Felix, by the way, in February at Cornell, that you'll be having in the coming weeks. So that's going to bring me to the third topic, the topic of zoning. So zoning is an entirely local issue. San Antonio has zoning just like virtually every other city in the United States, other than Houston, my hometown. But zoning is really important. It has huge effects on how our communities develop. It controls every inch of San Antonio. It controls what kinds of things will be developed, how big buildings will be, how big lots will be, how much parking is required, how tall any buildings can be. And of course, zoning separates cities into different districts. I've written about a lot of stuff on zoning, but one thing that has become really clear to me is that zoning in many American cities has hurt historic places. We have not, as preservationists, been involved in zoning conversations at the local level to the extent that we should, because we haven't really changed structurally the approach of zoning boards to historic places. So I put this out to just say, what has zoning done to our historic cores and the places that we hold dear? So one thing that zoning in San Antonio and other places has done is it forces development outward. So it says with large minimum lot sizes, 1 acre homes, 2 acre homes here, we had a lot of those in Connecticut, that the only place to build those is further and further out into the city, out of the city. And what that does is it drives investment there instead of bringing investment to those historic places where new development could actually enhance our appreciation and our ability to protect historic places. Another thing that we see in zoning is minimum parking requirements. So 2 units per house or 4 parking spaces for every retail store has really hurt our ability to build the way we used to build. We also see over time, especially since the 1950s, the elimination of mixed use zoning. And that's not so much an issue in San Antonio. I know you have some pretty vibrant mixed use areas, but it is the case in lots of places around the country. And I'll use here in Hartford, again, where I'm beaming in from, that's in Connecticut, state capital. Zoning has created all of these issues. It used to be called the most historic city, the most beautiful city in the country, but we've lost so much of our historic fabric because we as preservationists haven't paid attention to the impact of zoning in our historic neighborhoods. We've lost entire blocks full of beautiful brick buildings for parking. We've lost brownstone row houses for vacant lots. So my family lives in an 1865 brownstone. We have one neighboring brownstone, another neighboring brownstone, and then we are surrounded by state parking lots for state workers. And that is the heart of the Elm Street Historic District where I'm living. So we also live across from the first public park in the country, Bushnell Park, and yet even here we could not protect these what used to be a park lined with brownstones from the pressures of development and the dominance of parking and other unfortunate modern urban needs. So my other project as a scholar and advocate has been to think about, in addition to preservation, writing about preservation in particular, has been to think about zoning laws and how they do and don't, how they could and should protect historic properties. So I'll also just mention that the National Trust for Historic Preservation has taken up this issue through a project called the Reurbanism Project. So I encourage you to check that out. They've done studies of zoning codes around the country. And there's also a growing recognition more broadly beyond the National Trust that this is an issue that we should, again, be proactive in. We should be proactive at whatever level we think might make change in writing laws and policies and helping people understand how, whether it's disaster law or housing policy or zoning laws, that these issues have a huge effect on historic places. So be sure, especially in zoning, to take that up at the local level. So I encourage you to do that. With that, I hope I've highlighted a few modern issues in preservation, given you a little food for thought as you kick off your conference. You are so lucky that you have national leaders like Shannon and Claudia, but also other leaders, my Latinos and Heritage Conservation colleagues, Sara Gould and Antonia Castaneda, among many, many others who have worked for the cause in San Antonio and grappled with many of these issues. So again, I thank you for welcoming me today in San Antonio, and I look forward to your questions. And I will move my computer so I can see it, and we'll open the chat. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. This was perfect way to kick off the conversation. And I have a ton of questions, and I hope that people in our audience will also have questions. One of the things that I was hoping we could talk a little bit more about is, you mentioned, I think in relationship to both the climate issues, like the extreme weather issues, and the need for housing and being able to accommodate modern interventions and things like that. One of the things that comes to mind for me is the tax credit program, and how that is, or in some cases is not, getting the results that we want. Like if you ask for examples of times when the Secretary of Interior standards are not getting us the results that we need necessarily, or maybe are hindering a project. And I can think of a local example where the building wasn't able to be altered for additional windows to create a workable housing situation, and as a result, it mostly got demolished because the council was persuaded to de-designate a portion of it. And it's just like you wonder if that's really what we, the kind of outcome we want. And so what do you think some of the potential like changes or enhancements to those incentive programs maybe should be, or that we should be talking about?
Yeah, that's a great question. So that's another, today I just was talking about, I started talking about the Secretary standards as it relates to climate change and the inability for us to address climate. But you raised another issue, which is the Secretary standards and the tax credit program. So this is something that I've also written about, and in this exact light, which is if they are being applied in ways that hinder the preservation of a resource, or it sounds like in the case of that example, discourage it completely, and leading to the resources lost, then we have to wonder what the Secretary standards are for. And this is something that other people have recognized as well. So this is not new, but thinking about them today, and the opportunity for us to really look at how they are interpreted and applied. They're also sometimes for development projects applied differently from one jurisdiction to another. In Connecticut, we've seen different approaches within the review process. So our State Historic Preservation Office might say one thing, and the Park Service might say something else. And that's not within the purview of the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, but it's certainly something that that we should all ask about, and try to think about ways to influence clarification, issuance of new guidance. So for the climate change angle, we've seen guidance issued on flooding, and a few new techniques on flooding. But as I've written in other contexts, we don't really have a good strategy for what happens when a building or a site has to be totally relocated because of flooding. So that's not really addressed in those guidelines. So I think that there's a commitment to start articulating, especially on the climate front. I think on the real estate development side, the Secretary standards often do their job. They're broadly interpreted, but there are these projects on the margins where you see interpretations that have led to less well-insulated buildings, less energy efficient buildings, longer term costs imposed on the development project, potentially for not so much gain. If you're thinking about, again, preservation, not just from the sense of buildings, but from the sense of preserving communities, preserving the places, and making sure that they're invested in and cared for. And again, part of that is making sure that the model for that overall, the upkeep and looking at the full life cycle of the building is something that is kind of taken into account at enforcement stage, at the tax credit stage?
On the both the topic of housing, I mean, obviously, affordable housing is a challenge that most everyone is dealing with in our country, and certainly something that we are working to address at the local level in San Antonio. And one of the things that we always say, and I not to take credit for it, I'm sure I copied it from somebody, but we know, I mean, I think most people generally accept that we aren't going to be able to build our way out of the climate crisis, and we're not going to be able to build our way out of the affordable housing crisis. Like we know we have to reinvest in existing buildings, make interventions that make them more energy efficient, reuse them. And so, people who are not preservationists will agree to this in general. And Don Ripkema is on, I saw, and so please chime in if I butcher this, but Place Economics posted just yesterday, I think, a stat that from 2011 to 2019, there were double the housing units from 1970 and earlier demolished than were created using the low-income tax credit. So, building is important. Building new housing is important. There's no question, but it's not the full solution. So one of the questions that I had for you, and that we've been talking about locally, is like how you see the role of incentives like preservation tax credits, or maybe even the time is right to finally get traction on the historic homeowner tax credit. Some of those types of things that could help make reinvesting in the existing buildings more financially feasible.
Yeah, so thanks for that question too. And I guess I when I was talking about housing, I assumed it went without saying that, we've created hundreds of thousands of housing units through rehabs of historic properties through the tax credit, the federal tax credit. And for those states like Connecticut that have additional state tax credits, and we also do have a homeowner's tax credit, that has really boosted preservation efforts in our state, because what it does is it ensures that people who are not building apartment buildings, ordinary homeowners, can benefit from the credit. And there have been changes made to our program in recent years that enable middle income and low income families to benefit from the credit and have some measure of priority. There's also caps so that extremely high cost renovation projects don't sap up all of the funding. So I think we have a pretty good balance here in Connecticut at the state level. I don't know whether Congress would ever consider in any serious way a federal historic homeowners tax credit. I know that Donovan and others, the Listokans, and all those who study the economic impact of tax credits, the ripple effects of those have made a really good case about why the investment we know works. The federal historic preservation tax credit has been so successful. Lots of those arguments could certainly be applied to a home ownership program, whether it's something that happens at the state level or the federal level. I don't know. It would be nice to see more of those programs popping up around, and I don't think Texas has one, if I'm not mistaken. But it's something that maybe that's something the preservation community works towards.
We do have one question in the Q&A, and just as a reminder to everyone, you can use the chat. I think there's also a question or two in the chat, which I will get to, but if you have a specific question, it might be easier to put it in the Q&A so I don't miss it. So regarding gentrification of historic districts, specifically displacement of homeowners, do property tax states have more problems than states with income tax? Like Texas doesn't have an income tax, we're property tax heavy.
So meaning does maybe you could rephrase it, just hold on. I'm not seeing it in the Q&A. Oh, okay, there it is. So I don't know that there's a link. I don't know of research that identifies a link between gentrification of historic districts, which, as noted, means displacement, but not just of homeowners, displacement of renters as well. I don't know that there's a link between the income tax characteristics of any state. I'd be interested to know what motivated that question, because it's a very specific angle, but I don't know of any research that has shown that there's a link.
Okay. There's a question in the chat from Donna Graves. She, of course, thanked you for your comments, and kind of talking about the ways that the Secretary of Interior standards can fail to help us reach our goals related to climate change, affordable housing, equity, etc. And then she asks, do you see your position at ACHP giving you a place to help bring the standards up to the challenges of the 21st century?
So as I mentioned, the standards are not written by the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. They're not part of that agency's purview. But the role of the Advisory Council is to help advise on different aspects, advise other agencies, advise the president, advise Congress on ways that the federal government can improve its approach to historic preservation policy. It has done that in recent years already. There is already a task force on climate change at the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, and in the potential hope that I may one day be confirmed to join that wonderful agency. I've been listening to the prior meetings that are publicly available, reading up on what that task force is doing. And I think that, that the Advisory Council is well positioned even before I got there to help to advise and move the ball forward on these issues. It's something that I've written about. I dropped a bunch of links there are assorted links, all free downloads in the chat, where you can get the footnoted versions of the Cliff Notes that I provided tonight. But I do see that the Advisory Council is already taking on that role. And I would just, my scholarship shows, it's in writing, I care about these issues too. So I would help take that ball and run with it. The standards are in the purview of another federal agency, but as I said, the Advisory Council advises other agencies on issues, and I think would very much look forward to a collaborative approach with what looks like a great new director of the Park Service, and of course the new Secretary of the Interior, both of whom have purview over these topics. So that would be an honor to be able to do that.
So we have a great question from Amy Castley in the chat. She says, I wanted to ask your thoughts about a difficult issue we're facing in San Antonio, and she's absolutely right. The use of building like code enforcement to pressure longtime poor and working class families to sell homes, often in the West Side that the family has owned for generations. And then the injustice of this practice, particularly in places like the West Side that were redlined, cut off from access to capital, even through the most recent generations. Is there a way to say that code enforcement should reflect a history of redlining?
And I think the question is there a way to say is there a way to maybe not see so much strict and code enforcement in areas that are redlined? I think that's maybe the gist of it, because I think what Amy is asking about is the strict enforcement of building codes in some neighborhoods versus others, maybe, or the strict enforcement of building code or housing code or sort of property maintenance code, really, I would think violations. Because it's a building code is really, we usually deploy that when you're getting a permit for construction, whereas a property maintenance type code is one which is ongoing. There are lots of different ways that communities have tried to address these issues. Some of them include funding for low-income property owners. Of course, the city of San Antonio is a city that probably doesn't have tons of money to spare for these issues. On the other hand, a little bit of investment in a property, fixing a porch, fixing a door, fixing a window, can go a really long way toward maintaining both the people in those homes. Just for that small amount of money, it may just be too much out of their budget to do that. And then comes all these cascading effects of enforcement. So a little can go a long way when we're talking about those kinds of programs. Other communities have looked at strategies through nonprofits, maintainers programs, maintainers collaboratives, how-tos on sort of self-maintenance, but that's not always feasible, especially for older property owners. So it's a really challenging topic. And one thing I would say is, you can address some of these issues through zoning and these other local tools that you might have in your toolbox. So helping to direct development around the margins of the historic West Side and allowing that development to actually be tall, be dense, but pushing it out of the areas where you have the small scale, the tinier homes that were shown in the video that typify many of San Antonio's small neighborhoods. And as the video said, are energy efficient, climate efficient, economical for families. I think you can try to address some of those through zoning, but again, that takes a technical read of zoning codes and just advocacy and getting people on the zoning commission who understand what that balance is, because you can't just say, we're never going to allow housing anywhere, we're going to just fight it all the time. You want to point to where it can be allowed, and that's what zoning can enable you to do. So long-winded answer, not a great, not a one-shot solution unless you start putting money into it and giving homeowner grants, which is what we've seen in some places. If you can't do that, then you got to resort to the other tools.
Yeah, and there is definitely an effort locally with the upcoming housing bond initiative to put money in, and one of the things that we as preservationists have been advocating for is trying to address issues and deterioration with properties before they get to the point of being threatened with demolition. It's much easier to give somebody a foundation grant or repair their roof or whatever it is than wait until it's to the point where they're really in an unsafe situation, but it's their family home and they don't have any alternatives. And so I think that's one of the tricky things, is figuring out where the right point of intervention is and how to fund that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, I think I've missed some questions.
There's a few more, and I could read them out for you, Shannon, if that makes
Sure.
it easier.
Yeah, go ahead, Claudia. Thank you.
Christopher Fullerton asked, preservation history might offer some insightful lessons learned, quote, inspiring examples, for instance, as well as cautionary tales that seem especially applicable to possible missteps in climate change adaptation planning. So, for example, perhaps this counts as potential redlining redo. Well-meaning adaptation planners are creating a hostile financial environment for historic property owners in historically underserved, flood-prone areas, both coastal and inland riverine, that excludes insurance coverage, limits loan access, lowers values, and potentially coerces sales, all without meaningful community engagement. Aren't preservationists tested by the experiences of quote, some clearing, urban renewal, particularly well prepared to help as advocates?
So this is a great question. And this is, one of those issues that's encompassed in, the extreme weather, natural hazard / climate change, however you want to call it, challenge to our historic places. We see at a large scale historic neighborhoods, especially those built for low-income people, at threat of particularly flooding, but not just flooding, wildfires as well, in some cases mudslides, but flooding is certainly the big one. I'm working with a colleague at Cornell on a project that is look at will hopefully will be funded, and that we can get a team of researchers together, but looking at ways to address these issues through different through changes in land tenure types, things like community ground up planning. Because one of the things that we see in especially the flood programs that you talk about is sort of, line drawing, as you mentioned, but also a focus on single family homeownership and owner occupied properties that are owned forever. The flood insurance program doesn't really, so in addition to the neighborhoods that you're talking about, the flood insurance program doesn't really work for multifamily housing, for lease properties, for co-ops, for condos. It just doesn't have the same kind of care and paid to those kinds of properties. That issue is magnified in the context of historic places, because the flood insurance program, as I've written in one of those links, also doesn't take into account the particulars of historic districts. And this is too where the secretary standards come into play, because there will be a point at which some of these neighborhoods will simply be underwater and unsalvageable unless we do think about things like relocation of the structures and of the families who occupy those structures, because it's obviously not just the structures that are important. This is all just to say that community planning and input on where those lines are drawn is important, but at some point the waters will have their say, and there's nothing that any amount of planning can do, because some of those buildings will be lost. So there's a balance right now, because we're at the point where we have enough information to know in many cases which areas will be prone to flooding, which areas and when they will get to the breaking point. But we haven't really taken those hard steps and made sure that the steps to get to the point where we are either moving the buildings or abandoning them, how we're treating the families who live in them. We haven't really gotten resolution on that for historic or any other properties. And we especially haven't gotten to resolution on that on properties other than single family homes that are owned in perpetuity through a fee simple type arrangement. So I just think it's a really important question, and I have no good answer, but the points are well taken.
Reminds me a little bit of some of the work that Robin Bronin is doing, and one of the hopes that we have is to continue these conversations through a speaker series. So maybe you and Robin can come talk about this in the future. And I know we're running out of time, but I want to get a couple of other important questions in here. Back to the topic of housing. Build upon ask what your thoughts are on the viability of mobile home parks as historic districts, especially given their capacity to support low-income housing needs. And should they be eligible for historic rehab tax credits?
Now, I'm gonna plead ignorance and say I don't know. I don't think that they are eligible for federal income tax credits now. Correct me if I'm wrong. And I guess the question is, should they be? That's a really interesting question I haven't considered. I'm sure, and Reed Nelson and some others are on the call. They could probably tell you right off the bat, the number of mobile homes and the communities that are on the national register. You may have some on the local register. I'm not sure. It's not something, since they're not buildings, they would fall under possibly structures, but they still would, if they satisfied the current criteria for the National Register, be designatable. So I don't know that that I think your first question is, they don't have to be buildings to be designated on the National Register, and I assume also not in your local register. So viability as a historic district, sure. In terms of the historic rehab tax credit, I don't know that they are now. It's almost along the same lines as the individual homes, which are also not eligible for a tax credit. A home is a home, whether it has wheels or not. So, if Congress and others, it's your states, Texas and other states that people are beaming in from tonight, have defined mobile homes to be included in home ownership tax credits. That seems to be a potential venue for that. I don't think they're included now in definitions of multifamily housing in most, certainly not state tax credit programs.
Sounds good, thank you. And see that's creating a little bit of a discussion in the chat.
Oh, good.
We'll come back to at some point too. So I'm going to skip one here, and I'll come back to Samantha's. I'll come back to your question, Samantha. But
I really want to answer Samantha's question, though.
Okay. All right. So you want to go to that one first? Then go right ahead.
Oh, either one, whatever. But I don't want to miss that one.
We won't. I wanted to just go first to, in your role as chair, would you be willing to leverage your position in support of the PRO, Protecting Right to Organize Act, while supporting all workers, tradespersons in particular could benefit, and believe more robust union apprenticeship programs can help clear a much needed gap in our workforce?
Gosh, I feel like I'm at my Senate confirmation hearing again. I think I'll pass on that one because I don't know enough about it. Certainly, the advisory council already has again another task force set up to address and hopefully expand pipelines for historic preservation workforce. That was a priority of the previous chair, Amy Giorgiani. So that's something that's in their thoughts. Again, not something that the advisory council makes rules on or regulates, but more in that promoting capacity and hoping that the advisory council can, its current members have hoped that they can influence others to look at preservation and the preservation workforce as being really important. So I'll punt on that one.
That sounds good. We're interested in trades here because, as Shannon mentioned, we have started our trades academy. So that will be an important question to look into at some point. All right, Samantha's question. First of all, she thanks you for being here today and asks, what are methods to mitigate the parking requirement for zoning in a city as widespread and car focused as San Antonio?
You just make it zero. That is if there is one thing that every community should do to protect historic properties, is to completely eliminate minimum parking requirements. Okay, so this is why. So Hartford, the city of Hartford, when I was in the planning commission here, became the first major city to completely eliminate minimum parking requirements. And this was our rationale in our very historic city. Parking requirements imposed by zoning have forced communities and property owners all over the country to tear down historic places so that they can satisfy parking requirements. If you have a historic building and you want to convert it from one use to another, your zoning code will always require you to satisfy the current requirements of the code. So if you don't have enough parking on your lot, what are you going to do? You are going to buy the lot next door, tear down the building, and put your parking to satisfy zoning there. But if you look at the way our main streets developed, if you look at Houston Street, where you have so many beautiful buildings in San Antonio, that there is not a single curb cut inside the blocks. You have the streets, you have no curb cuts, you just have building frontage. That would be totally impossible to build in most American cities today. What would happen is somebody wants to redevelop what mostly happens is somebody wants to redevelop, they tear down for parking. Again, I live it right here on my block where parking has dominated. There have been entire city blocks, entire huge buildings that have been torn down here to satisfy parking requirements. I have colleagues, so I have a colleague, former colleague at UConn, Norman Garrick, who is a scholar of transportation, a transportation engineer, a traffic engineer. And he and Chris McCahill of the Smart Growth Institute have done these incredible studies that have shown that every time you provide parking, people will drive more. And so if you provide parking, you make it easy for people to drive, so they will drive more. And when people drive more, they will demand more car infrastructure. And then you will end up, instead of building housing or breweries or hotels or other amenities for the community, you build parking infrastructure, and it's just this sort of vicious cycle. So we've eliminated it here. We have had many redevelopments where the developers know that if they have tenants, they're going to want parking. They find the parking wherever they share garages, they build a little parking. But what we're trying to do is change the mindset. Instead of minimums, we have maximums on every use. We say you can only build this much parking on your lot. After that, forget it, go somewhere else to put parking on to go to a parking garage. We have street parking as well that's in congested areas managed by the city pretty well. So I would say, if I can get on my zoning soapbox, the number one change that you should advocate for in San Antonio and cities across the country for historic places, if you care about those, is to eliminate minimum parking. Everything else will get better from there.
Muted. There's a charge for us. Okay, we want to be respectful and mindful of everyone's time. We were trying to keep this to an hour. There are two more questions, I think, in the chat. If we want to address them briefly, if you don't mind, and then we will wrap up. Claudia, do you want to summarize the last two questions real quick?
Yes, I'm going to try and make it short. So there are inconsistencies between cities' master plans and city zoning laws, and then community master plans, all of which have usually gone through some sort of community engagement. So while a master plan, a community plan might call for a low density single family residential, the zoning code, either because it's incorrect, which we have dealt with here in San Antonio, or some other reasons, are zoned as multifamily apartment buildings. So the sort of tension between them is creating problems. So have there been legal challenges to zoning laws that disregard community input? Or is there any broad requirement of community input in zoning?
So zoning regulatory changes, so if you're changing the zoning code, will always require a public hearing. So it will always require public input. The standard for zoning commissions to make decisions on regulations is usually just a general rational basis standard. So they only have to, if they're legislating, changing the zoning code, if your city council is changing the zoning code, it's really only is there any reason that they could have justified this? And then if there is, then it's good. So even if all the people come out against something, if there's a good reason that the city council ignores that input and goes forward with a change, then typically they can do it. So I'll just use that, brief summary. I am the co-author of a 91 chapter zoning treatise that's a couple million words long, and there are several chapters that deal with this exact topic. So just to say that this question is not a small one to answer, but I'll just say generally, and in some states, and I don't know that Texas does, but the master plan, a city's plan will not necessarily change. A plan will not require a zoning code to be changed in response to a plan. Typically, what will happen is that new changes to the zoning code will have to comply with the plan. And there's some states with slightly different rules. I don't know if Texas is one of them, but the plan is aspirational. It's not typically viewed by courts as being regulatory or being mandatory. Don't take this as legal advice.
It gives us something.
Great, last question.
All right, our last question comes from one of our own historic design review commissioners. Jeffrey Fetzer asked, appraisals in gentrifying neighborhoods raise property taxes. Are there any examples where the homeowner's taxes are not raised until the home is sold? This way, the longtime homeowners are not priced out of their homes as long as they live there.
That's a great example, a great question. And I know that there are some jurisdictions that have dealt with that. If you have the authority to do that and under San Antonio's home rule charter, I would love to see San Antonio do something like that, because here in Hartford, we don't have skyrocketing property values in every neighborhood, but property values naturally rise over time, and we do see elderly homeowners in particular on fixed incomes who can't afford property taxes, and that you see that in communities all over the country. But this is a nice solution to that, and maybe if it's applied only to historic neighborhoods, you might see a little bit more political appetite for doing something like that. But again, that's a local decision that's got to be made pursuant to your state authority. And see, this is where I go off the rails and just start talking about law. So I appreciate that all of the questions. Hopefully I didn't get too technical here today, but at the same time, I know there's such a depth of expertise on this call in your city. And I'm just really grateful to have the chance to chat with you and learn from you. So thank you to Shannon and Claudia for inviting me.
Well, thank you on that note. Thank you very much for spending the last hour with us. And I know everyone has really enjoyed your presentation and the Q&A time. We really appreciate everything that you've shared with us. I also want to quickly thank Claudia Guerra, who's our cultural historian, who has been doing a lot of the work behind the scenes, and our tech guy, Sean. Thank you for making this work smoothly. And then again, to everyone who's here with us this evening, we have important local partners that I'm thrilled to see, as well as peers from all around the country. And so we're really happy to have all of you. And I look forward to participating with you in the conversations over the next 3 sessions. We'll reconvene tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. Central Time. Have a good evening, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you, everyone.